everyone. Thank you for being here in this hot Saturday afternoon. My name is Chiara, and I'm going to talk about the evolution of the cult of Dionysus. First, I would just like to say how I came to do this research. I'm an independent researcher, so I started this research spontaneously one day after I had a very intense experience after my first night in the dance floor of the Boom Festival. That is this big festival that happens in Portugal every 2 years with electronic music, big dance floors, thousands of people dancing together in the middle of nowhere, completely underground. Most of the people don't know about it. This was 2004, so even less people knew about it than they do now. So I emerged from this crazy night with a feeling that the experience that I had was the most radical and transformational that I've ever had. So many people dancing together, a feeling of oneness that I had never felt before with so many people that I didn't know, a feeling of intimacy and of having shared something that would be with us for the rest of our lives, something more, even more political than any political demonstration that I had been to. And so when I emerged in the morning, I thought, the question was, how did we get here? Is this something new, or is it a new way of doing something old? And so, spontaneously, I started reading book after book, very also without any sense of urgency, but even just allowing the books to come to me. And with time, I put together a research that I called the evolution of the cult of ecstasy in the West. So really exploring what are our own Western lineages, traditions of certain practices, the practice of altered state of consciousness that is triggered by specific techniques. And so specifically, I focused my research in the Greek and Roman times, because this is such a special time in our history that is before Christianity and after, or at the end of paganism. So right in that special time when also patriarchy was beginning and the previous culture was fading away. So this is a time of cultural big cultural transformations. So, first of all, I would like to ask you, is there here someone that, how many of you know about Dionysus, maybe just that he's the god of wine and maybe theater, and nothing else? Okay, so we will go also a bit deeper about what does Dionysus, I always say Dionysus with my Italian accent, but I think Dionysus is the actual pronunciation. So, Dionysus usually is known as the god of wine. He's represented with grapes, drinking, already drunk, someone needs to help him to walk. Another name is Bacchus. So we will talk about that because that's the name he took when his cult was imported to Rome. So Dionysus was more like the Greek name, and then Bacchus was the Roman name. Pan is a similar archetype, but it's not really the same one. So this is the Dionysian cult. But actually we go straight into the similarity with Pan, saying, so this association with the wine and drinking, it's mainly a later association, more typical of the Hellenistic and Roman times, while in an earlier phase, Dionysus was a vegetation god, so a chthonic god, the god of the earth and of the plants. And so in the earlier classical texts, he's referred to as the power of the tree, the blossom bringer, the fruit bringer. So what is that brings the blossoms and the fruits? What's the power of the tree? So this is the energy that pushes the seed, that pushes the plant out of the seed. And then that pushes the flowers, and then from the flowers, the fruit. So this energy, this is life's energy. This is life willingness to reproduce itself. This is the energy of existence. This is the energy that makes plants and animals and us too alive, with life. So this kind of energy that also Kereni describes as the archetypal image of indestructible life, life that wants to make more life and more life and more life. So this is the same energy that also triggers attraction between people. It's the same energy as sexual attraction. So also he's known as the god of sex and sexual pleasure. There we see him with Eros, and also the connection between Eros and the altered state of consciousness. We can see there, we will talk more about that. So yeah, I was talking about the fact that this life energy that pushes the plant out of the seed is the same energy as the energy of attraction between people. Thanks. So this way to look at creation as one organism that is moved by this erotic energy that permeates everything that is alive is actually typical of pre-patriarchal cultures, or known as goddess cultures or fertility cults. And here we see an example in an ancient Egyptian plague, where we see Isis rising with the plants in her hands, but we see that something else is also rising in the gentleman next to her. And this is really the symbol of this life energy that permeates everything and is the sexual energy. So there's many theories to where the cult of Dionysus come from. I like the one that says that there is a main connection to the Minoan culture of ancient Crete, the island of Crete in the south of Greece. So this Minoan culture was quite evolved, and women had quite a prominent role. They were priestesses, they were very active both in the religious and in the political life. And on Crete is the place where, for the first time, the name Dionysus was found, Dionysus, something like that, from the 13th century before Christ. So considering the possibility of this cult to come from this kind of culture where women had a prominent role and where religious life was, there were priestesses, main actors in the religious life, it shouldn't be a surprise to know that the earliest form of the cult, as early as the 8th century before Christ, so we're talking almost 3,000 years ago, the most archaic form of the cult was practiced by women, the Maenads. I don't know is there someone that have never heard of the Maenads? Okay, like half maybe. So these Maenads, the word comes from the Greek word to be crazy or to go crazy or to ravel, to rage, to go mad. And they were also known as bacchantes, and this is the word of Bacchus that also means to revel. So these women, they would live their normal life and they would go on the mountains about every 2 years in the middle of the winter to be by themselves without the supervision of the husbands, which back then was already quite scandalous and already a bit different than the archetype of the good wife. And so they would be there, barefoot, hair down, wearing animal furs and holding this thyrsus, that is this fennel stalk with ivy on top. And so they would run on top of the mountains and be there in the winter by themselves. So what would they do? So what we know, of course, there's many stories about them, and most of them are legends, and it's hard to tell myth from reality, and what did really happen, what was just a rumor. So what we know from iconography is that they were experts. They would play the frame drum, that is the most ancient, one of the most ancient instruments and typical of any shamanic practice. So the frame drum, the aulos, they would be experts of trance music making and trance music dancing. So they would be the inheritors of an uninterrupted lineage of women playing the drums and knowing the rhythm patterns that would be needed to induce an altered state of consciousness. I was in the workshop of Fariba the other day, and she was explaining how just changing a little bit the frequency, the speed of the beating of the drum, how it already affects consciousness. And so this is just a little something that we can still figure out about the power of the drum. But here we are talking about women that inherited many hundreds of years of expertise of how to play this drum. So this knowledge has been severed. This has been repressed at some point in Western culture. So this is where this knowledge was still very alive and very effective, and they were the experts of it. So they would also, and that's why Dionysus is also known as the Lord of the Dance and the Giver of Ecstasy. So they were also experts of the power of plants, especially psychotropic plants. So they would be experts of creating special potions using especially special wild plants to create that specific potion that would induce a collective state, altered state of consciousness. So here we see them mixing. There is theories that actually in the mountain ritual they would not use wine because in the winter the wine would not be ready yet. And also because wine represents more like a tamed version of, it's a tamed plant because it's the way it's cultivated and the way the wine is produced, while probably on the mountains they would use something that would be more readily available like mushrooms or mixing special barks and seeds and fruits. So I'm not an expert of the specificities and I always get questions about it, but there's books that talk about what specific plants and how they would be used. Then ritual sexuality would be another of the techniques that would be used by the Maenads. The ritual sexuality would be commonly used in fertility cults of the previous times, even before the Maenads. And also ritual sexuality would happen afterwards, after the men also joined. And I put a picture there to show. Usually this is the kind of vases that you find only in the basement of the museums. So, but know that they are there. They left us some snapshots of what kind of activities they would do, because it's so hard for us to even imagine what they would do. As Sasha Cobra was explaining yesterday, we have so much shame and so much sense of guilt even just to think about these things. So these are the people that didn't have so much of that shame. This is the pre-Christian women and then also men. And so this I want to say here, that because of all these ritual practices, we could already say that the Maenads were the great-great-great-granddaughters of the women of the hunter-gatherers of the Neolithic and even Paleolithic times, and because of the being experts of which kind of plants and also using shamanic drums and sexuality, but also the Maenads are the great-great-great-grandmothers of the witches that were then repressed in the European witch hunts in the later centuries. So it's the same lineage, and it's good to put things in perspectives every now and then. So this is a slide about the connection between drumming and sexual energy. In many ancient cultures, drums were associated with feminine sexual energy. As instigator of creation, the goddess manifested in sexual desire and union. The drum she held identified her with the primal rhythms of life, apparent in the sexual act. So, the drum is this very magic tool, and in a way I also describe it as repetitive beat device, like a portable repetitive beat device. And so with this rhythm, creating specific patterns, many things, many special things were possible. So, As we have seen also the other night when I happened to play some music outside, music is an amazing tool to reach a state of enthusiasm. So the Greek called it enthusiasmus. So this word enthusiasmus is the same word that then was used to name psychedelic in a different way that was not psychedelic, which is entheogens. So this entheos, to have God within or to manifest the God within. So it can also be translated as engoddedness. So to feel full of this life energy that wants to make you scream and jump and shout and just move your body as much as you wish, this kind of energy was seen as the essence of this spiritual practice. So it was all about being filled with this energy, and this energy is what would make you feel like a god. So this kind of state of enthusiasm in Greek times would be seen as to be possessed by Dionysus himself, because it would be seen as to be completely full of the life energy that is the same life energy of the plants, the same life energy that the animals that run on top of the mountains have. So the idea was to become one with this energy, and in a way to become one with the divinity. So if humans could assimilate the power that made life triumphant in the world of nature, they too might live in a more complete way, because their human nature would be completed by the divine nature that they also can hold within themselves. So this state of enthusiasmus was known as mania or divine madness, a state of possession, being possessed by the god of ecstasy, that was triggered by all those techniques that I've shown you before. So Plato, in the Phaedrus, says there are two kinds of madness, one arising from human diseases, and the other from a divine release from the customary habits. Dionysus presides over the telestic madness. So madness here is mania, divine madness, altered state of consciousness, which is a consequence of being away from your customary habits. So that's why the Maenads would go on top of the mountains. They would live their daily life and would be removed from their routines so that they could enter in completely different space. And Dionysus is the one that presides over that kind of mania that arises. The telestic madness is the altered state of consciousness triggered by those practices. Telestic madness refers to ritual madness, telos or teletai, where the ritual, telos is the purpose, it's connected to ritualistic madness. So the specific state that you enter on when you are practicing the dancing to repetitive beats, psychotropic plants, and even ritual sexuality. So mad women of this kind, you can already imagine. So Dionysus is also known as he who drives women insane. So these kind of women already back then were considered maybe too crazy to be good women. So already they would receive a lot of bad publicity, let's say, by those that would write about them. Because also, of course, we don't have any direct report from them. They would not write. And so it would always be like a third, fourth, fifth hand report that we would get, and most of the time would be full of all kinds of negative rumors and negative legends. These women, they abandon their life, they are weirdly inverted because they behave like men, they hunt animals, they can even kill the animals with their hands, and they forget about breastfeeding their children. They would rather breastfeed the children of the animals, like the babies of the animals. And so there is a lot in Greek literature about this. And especially in this, I'm going to just mention here the Bacchae by Euripides, that is maybe one of the most important ancient texts about Dionysus, where Dionysus arrives to Thebes and he decides that he wants all the women to run on top of the mountain to dance with him. And the king of Thebes, Pentheus, is really not up to Dionysus' plans. He disagrees, and he, in a way, embodies the kind of male archetype that at the same time is very attracted to this possibility of seeing women on top of the mountains, but at the same time he's disgusted by this craziness and this irrationality. So we hear from his words what he thinks about the women of Dionysus. With women, when grapes appear at the feast, the rites, I say, can never be good. So if women get high, it's never going to be a good thing. So the chorus of the Bacchae replies, "What a disrespect for religion. Stranger, don't you respect the gods?" So from this quote, we see the cultural clash between the previous cultural lineage, where women were free and able to alter their consciousness as they wished, especially as a spiritual practice, and the new culture that was already starting to repress them. Also, these are quotes from a much later time, and we see how this myth of the Maenads has entered the collective subconscious. And so all the way until the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, when women started to fight for the right to vote, the contemporary commenters would call them Maenads in a negative way. For example, I'm going to read, "This little knot of Maenads, these insurgent wild women, are in a sense unnatural. They have not bred true. There is in them a curious inversion of sex." Or the unwomanly and unseemly tactics of the political Maenads and the vote-desiring bacchanal. Hereafter, this outbreak will stand in history as an instance of national sickness, of moral decadence and social disorder. Thank God the history went in another direction, at least in the West. But just to see how this act of going on the mountains and being Maenads was empowering for these women, and how this empowerment is also seen in the women that want to vote, and still, after so many centuries, considered as a negative thing. So in reality, what was the whole point of this mountain ritual? I call it a training in liminality, but we could also say a training in non-duality, using this language that we use here, because liminal space is the space in between. So these were first-hand experiences of that space where you're not civilized and you're also not uncivilized. You are in between. You're not a woman and you're not a man. You're not crazy, but you're also not sane. You're using a substance that can be a poison or a remedy at the same time, depending on the dose in this specific, most of the times. So, to be a human and to be animal, to attain sanity by means of going deep into insanity. So this kind of paradoxical state that also is actually a reflection of the paradoxical nature of reality. In this kind of ritual, you have a first-hand experience, like a bodily experience. It's not someone talking to you about it. It's a first-hand experience. And so this would be the value of it, to come back home more complete, more whole, and understanding reality from this paradoxical perspective, and not in this black and white, right, wrong, dual way of looking at reality. So at some point, men also entered the ritual. From this image and many others of similar kinds, we see that consent was an issue even back then. But It's funny because really there's many, it's like a topos, many of these images. Yeah, and in general here I want to point to the ambiguity of the practice itself. So the paradoxical, what is a paradox is not just reality, but the practice itself that allows you to see reality in a paradoxical way. So the altered state of consciousness has both beneficial and destructive outcomes. And the Greek knew, and the Greek respected this. And so it was really a kind of practice that allowed people to be aware of how the same tool can be used to obtain completely different outcomes. We're going to go on. And so what I wanted to say about when men joined the rituals was that the kind of men that were most welcome, not only, but homosexuals and people or men wanting to experience this, experiment with their gender identity were most welcome. Dionysus himself is very often represented as an androgynous god. And this ancient quote says, "The rites of Dionysus customarily put women in the clothes of men as much as they dress men as women." So again, this ambiguity, this ambivalence, and this paradox was of the god and of his followers. So these rites became very popular. Many people participated, mainly in private initiations that happened in private houses covered by secret. Then there was also the public version of the cult with public processions marking the seasonal changes. But specifically, I want to focus in these private initiations that were then very fast exported into the Roman Empire. So what happened? Membership to the club of Bacchus, this is how Dionysus was called in Rome, membership was open to everyone. So women were there, slaves, and immigrants or foreigners. So this was already quite radical in a very hierarchical society like the Roman society. Women had prominent positions. They were priestesses that could initiate men. And this was a subversion of the role of women that was already in an inferior position in comparison to men. People were free to experiment with their gender, with non-binary gender identities. Everything was allowed in a way. And this kind of rituals promoted a strong bond between the people that shared them, because sharing the experience of altered state of consciousness in a group creates a strong connection, a very intimate connection. So all of this became more as the amount of people increased that were participating, and when even members of influential rich families started to join, this became a real threat for the maintenance of the status quo of the Roman society that was very hierarchical, patriarchal, but also military. And especially in this point of the military society, any military society relies on the fact that there is a bond between those that will be soldiers and the authority that will give them orders. When the bond between the authority and its soldiers is threatened by the possibility that these people have stronger bonds between themselves, so this was extremely scary. So what happened? At some point, the Roman Senate decided that this was getting out of control. Also because this cult was imported without the authorization of the Senate. While many other foreign cults that were usually tolerated in Roman society had been imported with this special authorization, like official authorization. So at some point, they decided to create a fake scandal. A woman, they said that this woman finally revealed what was happening in the initiation that, as I said, was covered by secret. And she revealed that there were all kinds of nasty things happening. And so this was used as an excuse to then repress the cults. But what I'm going to read now is actually some quotes from Titus Livius, that is a Roman historian, that is the only source that we have about the repression of the Bacchanalia. The Bacchanalia were the initiation rites in honor of Bacchus. Then the Bacchanalia were repressed in 186 before Christ. And from Titus Livius, we have even pieces of the speech that this consul Lucius Postumius gave to the General Roman Assembly to convince the Romans that it was a good thing to repress the Bacchanalia, which was not such an easy thing to do, because back then the people were aware that this was an ancient tradition, a cultural lineage that was respected in Greece. And so it was not easy to say, okay, from now on this god is outside of the law. It was actually very tricky. So, these are the words already of Titus Livius. So the movement still has no power, but it is experiencing a large increase in numbers, growing bigger every day. It has almost formed a parallel city. So this parallel city shows that there were two value systems in the same population. That there were two parts that were running according to obedience or observance of two different sets of values. A great part of them are women, and they are the source of this evil thing. Next are males, scarcely distinguishable from females, dancing frenetically, having lost their minds by lack of sleep, by drink, by the confusion and the shouting that goes on throughout the night. Citizens of Rome, do you feel that young men initiated by this oath of allegiance should be made soldiers? Will they take the sword to fight to the end in defense of the chastity of your wives and children? So here you can see how the consul is putting the finger in the button of fear. He's really triggering the fear in the people. Guys, these are not good soldiers. The enemy is going to arrive, and your wife and children, very bad things will happen to them. So we can see how the authority created this narrative to repress the cult, to repress the people participating, and to outlaw the practices. So the law that was created was called the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus. It was actually found, and this is a miracle, like a historical miracle, a copy of it was found in southern Italy, because once it was made, the law was distributed all over the empire, because this was to be observed everywhere. And so in the 1700s, they found underground a copy of the actual law that is a proof that Titus Livius told the truth about this repression of the Bacchanalia. And it's now conserved in Vienna in the Kunsthistorische Museum, in a little corner. No one is really paying attention, but actually it's quite an important piece of law. Because this is actually the first repression of people practicing altered state of consciousness in the West. And it's actually also the first religious, the first religious persecution in the Roman Empire. And what the law says is that people are not allowed to make any more initiation rituals. They're not allowed to honor Bacchus. And what they say actually is that in order for someone to still be able to perform a rite in honor of Bacchus, there has to be no more than 5 people. And for the authorization to come, there has to be at least 100 senators in the moment that the request is made. So they make it just really, really difficult to be able to organize another initiation rite. So this was the way, the strategy that they used not to repress completely, but to make it hard to happen. So Livius say, after the dismissal of the assembly, the whole city was seized by extreme terror. The following night, many people were caught escaping and were arrested. There was such a flight from the city that it resulted in a depopulation. It was very popular kind of activity. Those who were found guilty of Bacchic worship were condemned to death. All Bacchic shrines were destroyed. So many conclusions can be drawn, right? Every time I'm trying to make new conclusions and also to be open to other people's conclusions, because this is such a long history and such a special example of our Western cultural evolution that many kinds of conclusions can be drawn. But so here I write that the cult of Dionysus is a Greek adaptation of ancient shamanic cults. We could also say indigenous cults, because indigenous refers to this connection with nature that, as we saw, was one of the main features of Dionysian rituals. So this speaks to the Western indigenous roots. Now that we are connecting to foreign indigenous cultures and what are the indigenous people doing in South America, or what are the indigenous people doing in Siberia, actually what were our own indigenous roots? What did we do in the West when we were in close contact with nature? And the answer is those kind of rituals. So these ancient shamanic cults used altered state of consciousness as a spiritual practice to reach experiences of non-duality, of oneness, of feeling the possibility to be at one, no separation with other people, but also with the natural world. Their values question the very core of the newly born patriarchal culture. And because of their disruptive potential, they were brutally repressed. Culturally, politically, religiously, the repression was ruthless. Now that it's possible to practice some of these practices without being burned or without being killed, sometimes we can still go to jail, because most of the mind-altering substances are actually still criminalized. So people that are even using certain substances in full consciousness, in full responsibility, can still go to jail. And this tells us where we are in this evolutionary trajectory. But so now that something is now possible again, we can see a resurfacing of some form of modern Dionysian ritual. So I put some examples of, because also Dionysus is the god who comes and is the god that wears many masks. So Dionysian energy and Dionysian culture will always come back in a way or another, but often with a different disguise that will take us a bit to figure out what is behind that disguise. So, for example, psychedelic culture, as I was saying, can be seen as a resurfacing cultural manifestation connected to Dionysus. Any form of sacred sexuality, also what Sasha Cobra was pointing to yesterday, where sexuality is used as a spiritual practice, as a way to reach this, as a healing practice, as a way to connect to something bigger, to get out of your ego and your personality, to enter into a different space, and also as a group practice, which is a practice that has been completely removed in Western culture for all these centuries. Now we know, more or less, some of us can have some experience of that, because now again it's actually possible to do it. Club and festival culture, this is very dear to me, because this was my door into this world, and I still believe that is an amazing door to enter into the world of non-duality and the awareness of the oneness. And I still work in festivals, and I still really serve the young people that come there and have these very strong experiences without having a cultural frame to integrate them, to make sense of them. Then any earth-based spirituality like Wicca and pagan also connects to that, because when you see the divinity in everything, in the rivers, in the lakes, in the sea, in the plants, this kind of animistic way to look at reality, it's also possible to connect it with the Dionysian culture. But also feminism and reclaiming of non-binary gender identity, this is now resurfacing again quite strongly. I also associate this to a resurgence of the Dionysian, because also especially homosexual people, the fact that in Western society, Christian religion kind of put them aside. They were also deprived of the possibility to have their own spiritual lineage. And this is a way to reconnect with that spiritual lineage. And I want to say also maybe conferences that talk about non-duality can be seen as ways for the Dionysian energy to come back to us and bring us its message of oneness. Thank you very much.